Hi there, this is Amarah's Rabbitry, and today I'm coming at you with a video about culling in a rabbitry. I have with me my note card because this is a broad and multifaceted topic, and so I really didn't want to miss any key points. I wanted to start out by just defining what culling is in a rabbitry. Culling is the selection of somehow undesirable animals for removal from the gene pool, either by processing or by selling, like as pets, etc. It just means removing them from a breeding program, okay? So I used to not cull via dispatch, ever. I only sold, and that gets to be a lot, and some may argue the ethics of that as well, because you don't necessarily have any control of how your rabbits are used when they leave the house. That being said, I now am an advocate for dispatch culling. However, I really hate being wasteful, so I am all for methods that put the animal to good use somehow, whether you're eating the meat or they can be fed to animals and such. Some different ways that people might remove a rabbit from a gene pool, as I'd mentioned, would be either dispatch by themselves or sending them away to someone else who dispatches the use of their fur or their meat. And then there's also reptile breeders or zoos that use any size of rabbit from kit to full size to feed animals. And they take full carcasses and things like that. So it can be low hassle, but it's still going to a use. You can also sell pets and sell animals, and that is also culling. I think the most important things to decide when you're thinking about culling in your rabbitry are 1, knowing your line, and 2, knowing your direction. It is impossible to take on every single trait at once without being completely overwhelmed and over-culling. So it's really important when you're first starting out and developing your line to A, watch them as much as possible. If you have space, grow them out extra long and take lots of notes for each individual line you work with. And then 2, decide what traits are deal breakers for you in your rabbitry and which traits are more tolerable for the time being, because you cannot accomplish everything at once. This is a process, and it's going to take years and years of honing and skill. For example, when I first started out, I paid close attention at shows to what I was hearing was lacking in a lot of rabbits. And I decided to make those things the most important thing in my decisions for culling. So those things in my area were lack of lower hindquarter and lack of substance of ear. So I will say I don't really cull for substance of ear very often, but I definitely keep it as an important trait that I am breeding toward. But the low hindquarter issue is so prevalent and so difficult to get rid of once it's established that I have culled for that. The rabbit could have a really good front end, but if they don't have that body type I'm looking for, then I will cull them for that. Beyond that, there are general things that I would cull for, but it's important to know your foundation and to not overwhelm yourself with too much at once. Paying attention to how different lines mature is really important. I'm going to include some slides in this video at some point showing some different lines and how they developed so differently. There were several times that I thought for sure I was going to cull a certain rabbit, but I gave them more time and they ended up being a really solid animal. And then other times where the baby was beautiful from day one and stayed that way. So you just really have to know what you're working with. And that's why I'm a huge advocate for taking your time as you start out, trying to allow these rabbits to grow out 4, 5, 6 months if you can, just so you can get really well versed in each line. There are even some lines that take 8 or more months to fully develop. But again, that's something you can decide if you want to tolerate. Personally, I like to see good development earlier, and so that is going to be a part of how I approach my culling. I'm not going to wait 8 months for a rabbit to be what I want. Another important aspect is to remember that not all rabbits are show rabbits. It's important to keep parts animals as you're developing your own line. Rabbits that have something really excellent you're looking for, and then everything else may be fine, tolerable, and you can really use those as building blocks toward your ideal animal down the line. And consider that some animals are going to be brood type and some are going to be show type. This does not mean that they are less quality for being brood. It just means that their traits are not as flashy or showy, but they still are a powerhouse. Being in a small rabbitry, I have a limited selection of bucks and space. So every time I do a culling round, I keep in mind what traits I have, what I'm going for, and if certain crosses might improve the animal. At some point, you will have developed your own line so much that you will know exactly when any animal is ready to be considered for culling or keeping, because you will know the predictability of your lines. But remember, if you're mixing lines or your line is young, that is not something you can rely on. So again, I just hammer home, give them more grow out time if you can help. Next, I want to talk about some specifics about how I cull, what ages I cull, and what certain traits I look for at each age. Again, this is very specific to my line, which is why it's so important to know your foundation. One of the lines that I work with, the rabbits are very predictable, and from a very young age, you can tell which ones are going to grow up nicely and which ones aren't, and a surprise is rare. But in another line, there were several times I had what I thought were certain culls that ended up being solid animals. So I have learned that that line needs to grow out a little bit longer than I would think, that it can prove me wrong from my original view of the animal. So at weaning, I do very minimal culling, only serious things like persistent illness that is not getting better, failure to thrive, bad behavior, or serious structural issues, like if the rabbit has a very long low shoulder, a hooked spine, things like that. Those are things that are not going to grow out one way or another. So those are culls, but I often wait a little longer so that maybe I can utilize the meat from the animal and be less wasteful. At 10 to 12 weeks, this is a really big time for me to decide which rabbits are going to be culled or kept. Sometimes I've found that certain lines do need longer, maybe another month, to really know the truth about how they'll be, but I make most of my decisions around this point, so by about 3 months. What I usually do is once I select the culls out from the rest, I will put them in a bottom cage for another few weeks and just take a quick look at them before I process them. And there have been times I've kept an animal back that I thought I would be culling. And at 4+ months, this is when you can really know in many lines whether it's worth keeping this animal or not. There are very few lines, at least for me, that I like to work with that take longer to show value. I'm just not that patient. I'm a small rabbitry and I don't have the space to grow out for 6 or 8 months. I have definitely grown out animals to adulthood, just more selectively, whatever I have space for that I think is worth it. And then in that case, if I sell the animal, it's most likely I'll sell rather than cull. Then it's usually something that another rabbitry might benefit from. So now I'm going to show you some hands-on. All right, this is something important to note. These two rabbits are litter mates, and while you might not believe that at first glance due to their size difference, it's true. These does are around 5 months, and this one's almost to max weight, which is 3.5 pounds, while this one is more around 2.5 pounds. And that is because of the ever prevalent dwarf gene in Polish today. But that being said, because I'm evaluating this doe as a brood type and this doe as a show/brood type, I do view them a little bit differently. And so I'm still holding on to her because as a non-dwarf, I can still work with her. Something to point out is that rarer varieties might provide some more leeway in your rabbitry. This is a lilac, and I am trying to develop lilacs in my herd. And even though a trained eye can tell that he is not as high quality as some of the animals I keep, I think he is good enough to hold his variety place in the herd until I can improve the variety. So traits that I might not normally tolerate, like a little bit of lack in this lower hindquarter, as you can see, but not severe, are things I might tolerate in rarer varieties that I'm working with. I want to compare these two littermate brothers to help you visualize what I'm looking for. This is a broken lilac, and this is a blue. While it may be hard to really see in the video, you can tell that the blue has better conformation and structure throughout. Not only that, but he has a little more body to him, whereas the lilac just has sharper edges and bony protrusions and lack in that lower hindquarter. And so I have currently decided to let the lilac go and hold on to the blue. Not only the body type, but also the head, eye, ear combo. This blue tends to hold his front end a little bit better, whereas this lilac tends to lay his ears flat against the head, which is something too prevalent in my rabbitry right now that I'm trying to counter. So this guy's ear carriage is going to add a little bit to my line that I'm going for. Here are a young pair of chocolate does from the same litter. They're about 5 weeks old. And you're going to see them side by side. To me, it seems as though this one will be non-dwarf and this one could possibly be just smaller or dwarf. And I think that this one is going to mature large. That being said, I've had rabbits surprise me before, so I will likely hold on to her for at least a few months, even though in some cases it's an obvious cull. I don't consider this an obvious cull. To me, this one is pretty promising at this stage, and this one reminds me a lot of a brood doe I held on to with stellar body type, but she's bigger in size. She's not something that I would go for long term, but short term maybe. As you can see, even in these youngsters, they have hindquarter. They have some body type. You can actually feel their structure. And for me, that is pleasing when you have a great structure at a young age. That's why this line's easier for me to work with, because they do mature early. The other littermate boys, however, they started out very gangly and bony. And that line is harder for me because it does take longer for them to grow into themselves. You just need to know your line. So this is their brother. He is not ugly, but he's definitely also going to be large. And even though his body type looks good, decent, I just know for a fact he's not going to be able to measure up compared to the other rube buck that I am keeping. And so I'm already kind of prepared that he will be a cull or sell. He doesn't have any stellar traits enough right now for me to consider him special. I want to address something that I would consider a structural issue. See how this buck leans on the table? He's pushing away. Some rabbits will do that out of irritability, but I know that for him it's a structural thing. This is a rabbit that I've held on to that I believe in, but he has issues that many people would call for. So it's hard to see here, but the way he pushes his neck out indicates a long and low shoulder. While he can sometimes carry nicely, he often wants to carry out like this, and it destroys his pose. But in person, he has beautiful traits, and he is an example of something that someone might cull, but in my rabbitry, it's something I think I can work with. His dad also has a long, low shoulder and has only passed that down to a small percentage of his offspring. And I believe that he has enough excellent traits that I can hopefully breed this out with the excellent shouldered does that I have. So that's an example of something that I don't call for right now. That being said, if he had worse other traits, he would be long gone. It's really just this thickness of ear, bucky head, nice eye, and short, round, full body type throughout that keeps him here. I'm going to show some other pictures of this doe, but she's a doe that I would consider a natural beauty from day one with excellent structure in her shoulder. Just as an example for comparing to the buck I just showed you. See how she carries her head proudly, but not high and not low. It's carried perfectly just above the table. shows off her front end a little bit while also keeping the integrity of the top line. She's a rabbit that I knew from day one that I liked the feel of. When you're fighting your rabbit to pose them, sometimes it's a behavior thing, so you can wait and give them some time, but many times it's a structural thing, in which case many people will not tolerate poor structure in the rabbitry, especially if they're deeper in developing their line. She's pretty from all angles. I'm going to show an example of a couple of litter mates, separately though, and why I'm holding on to them as they grow. This is a doe. Her front end is really beautiful and she does have a nice body type, but she does lack some depth compared to my other animals. That being said, this line has proven to develop depth more with time. And so I'm holding on to her because I think that her traits are stellar enough to let her stay here until she's growing out a little more. And even if she stays like this, I still like her quite a bit and she could definitely benefit me or someone else. This is her full brother from the same litter. And from day one, he had a really flashy top line, nice body type, and I liked the placement and presentation of his front end and ears. That being said, he's kind of going through a gangly stage right now where he's not really showing off his short cobbiness. So it's one of those things that you got to give him time to grow into himself. They're at that 3 to 4 month mark right now. And at that point, they can tend to lose some of the balance that you kept them for. He always had a really great hindquarter, but right now it's failing a little bit, just in that lower portion. And so that's something that I will watch as he grows, but I'm still optimistic based on him when he was younger that he could turn out really nice. Couple of notes. It's easy to become barn blind when you're only looking at your own animals. And what that means is blind to certain serious traits, or maybe you don't even realize how nice your animals are until you're about to sell them. Or on the other end, if you go to a show and you get an opinion and you make huge sudden changes about your rabbitry, culling half of it or whatever, both things are not good. So make sure that you are diversifying a little bit, getting opinions from other people and taking them into stride, but also make sure that you keep your core intent first rather than letting other people decide your rabbitry direction. You should keep in mind what your goals are and then allow people's expertise to just gently change your direction, but nothing too serious. Again, this is a huge topic. There's so much I could talk about. So please ask me for more specifics. What do you want to know more about? And I'd be happy to go into more depth. Here's an example of a couple culls that to me were obvious from day one. These animals were either eaten or sold as pets. And for me, it's just really the feel. If they structurally feel completely off in some way, they're not short, full, and natural in their pose in any way, for me, that's an instant call. Here's a couple that I grew out longer that ended up being calls later. This broken blue buck was looking cute on the front end, but just a little feeble, narrow, fine-boned, and lacking in lower hindquarter throughout the body. Nothing spectacular. And I wanted to give him a chance to grow out since the line was a little new to me. He did not end up developing further in those traits, and so he ended up being a call later in life. This black doe, being a non-dwarf, this deals with the dwarf and non-dwarf issue in Polish that shouldn't be there but is, grew out to be so much larger than expected and longer in type. And I ended up having to cull her even though her body type was excellent, but everything else was just too ugly. Here are a couple examples of culling for health issues. This guy had a persistent eye infection that wasn't responding to treatment. If he were higher quality, I may have tried harder, but because he was already mediocre, I ended up culling him after a couple weeks of trying to help him. And then this doe, she stopped producing after a semi-traumatic birth, and it turned out that I could see that her womb was inflamed, and so she was clearly suffering a little bit, and she got called from the program because she wasn't producing. So that was that situation. Here's an example of how lines mature differently. This doe, Posh, was pretty from day one. It didn't take much for me to know she was gonna stay. That being said, these other two animals, were completely shocking in their transformation from before to after, which was a different line. So that just goes to show you need to know your line and give them a chance. And lastly, here are a couple of chocolate sisters that I kept side by side for a while. I ended up selling Iris and keeping Ivy. Even though people couldn't quite tell from pictures that she was better, it was obvious by feel, and you can see in this final picture that she really grew into herself. She is my first registered and granted homegrown, so she's definitely very special to me. So, thank you so much for watching, and have a good one.